Hey everyone, I'm Scott Stokely, and last night I was hanging out with one of the pioneers of the Pro Disc Golf Tour from the early days, Leonard Muse, and it got me thinking that I wanted to do a video about the history of the PDGA Professional Disc Golf Tour. Now, my original idea was to sit here and talk for about 5 hours, which I could pretty easily do. There's a lot to this story. But I thought, maybe I'll make it more digestible. And let's see if I can do a 20-minute cliff notes on how our Pro Tour started back in the early days. So it goes back to Ed Hedrick and the DGA. Now, if you ask people, they'll tell you that Ed Hedrick invented disc golf. He did not. Disc golf was actually invented by... We have no idea. As soon as flying discs started being sold around the country, people independently started inventing this game where you played a version of golf with a frisbee. And we come to find out later, people are like, well, we were playing this in Alabama, we were playing this in Rochester, or we were playing this in Michigan, and who knows who invented it. What Ed did was he patented the basket. I believe George Sapperfield talked him into pursuing this disc golf game as the future, or one of the futures of flying disc sports. So that's what Ed did. He patented the basket, went, he got a bunch of courses put in. He was, certainly he was Ed, right? I mean, he was the godfather or grandfather, whatever you want to say, of our sport. Now, the thing about Ed and the DGA was that Ed was challenging at times to work with. Now, I want to be clear about something, because I'm not going to say anything bad about Ed. Ed was a businessman, and DGA was a business. And as with many things, great things came out of the desire to make a business out of something and make money. And that's what Ed did. And if you ask any of the old timers about Ed, most of the opinions are going to be mixed, and they're all fair. At the same time, Ed goes on the Mount Rushmore of disc golf. He's on my Mount Rushmore, certainly. He's credited with everything he's done. So, big fan of Ed. And by the way, DGA, right now, today, is a fantastic company run by amazing people with great discs. Check them out. So none of this is a knock on Ed, but Ed was running the DGA for Ed. And the sport was growing, but also simultaneously being held back. So a number of players got together and said, we want to create a players organization, and that was the birth of the PDGA. Now, in the early days of the PDGA, really it was just a club. It was global, mostly in the U.S. and Canada, but mostly U.S., but expanding everywhere. And except for, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Daryl Lynn was the first paid administrator, and I'm certain he was well underpaid. It was an all-volunteer organization. So they did a great job in the early days trying to grow the sport and make it professional. And one of the things they did was to sanction tournaments. And when you sanctioned a PDGA tournament, all that really was required is that you paid money and agreed to loosely, you didn't agree to loosely play by the rules, you agreed to play by the PDGA rules. They were loosely enforced at many tournaments. But the tournament directors in those days learned how to run tournaments from nobody in many cases. This is why it was the Wild West days. There was no disc golf before disc golf. So these early tournament directors were inventing how tournaments would be run, and with many hits and many misses along the way. But tournaments started popping up all over the country, and when you joined the PDGA, you got a disc, you got to be a member of a club, you got a little membership card that Daryl Lynn would actually handwrite your number on, and but it was cool. We were part of this global club of this great sport of disc golf. We literally had hundreds of players, and we're going to become massive someday. We all knew, no one else knew or believed, but we did. But anyways, you're running these tournaments are taking place all over the country. The goal was to grow the sport, make it into a professional sport. Everyone that ran it and tried to put together the tour did it out of nothing but pure love. but also, you know, inexperience, and it was what it was. Probably the greatest thing that at least in my opinion, that the PDGA did with its disc golf event slash what they called a tour, wasn't a tour yet, was to create an insurance policy. Many of the tournaments running today never even would have started had the PDGA not provided an insurance company that the tournament could take to the park and say, we are doing what is necessary to run an event. We take liability, right? So the PDGA did a great job in the early days, but it was a new organization, right? Volunteer based. There wasn't really a tour at this point. You collected points, which really didn't mean a whole lot because some places had a lot of tournaments, some had one a year. Didn't really tell you who was better or worse than anybody else. It was just the first metric of any kind to compare players of different regions when they competed at these tournaments. But also when you won a PDGA tournament, you won a professional sanctioned event. It was a big deal. So there were tournaments. There was not a tour. There were different clubs and groups around the country that put together little disc golf series of events. I know there was one in Iowa. Jeff Harper just let me know about a 5-event series in the mid 80s. But I consider the start, and by the way, I'm going to come up with all my own definitions for these things. These are not etched in stone. These are just my opinions of how to define things like tours and touring players. But the first actual tour, I believe, was the Can-Am series. And the reason I call that the first tour was because it was the first attempt to bring players in and actually travel and compete. Before then, and I'll talk about some of the players, there was only one player before the Can-Am series that I would consider a touring disc golfer. Now, again, totally my definition, but what I consider a touring disc golfer is one of two things. It is not someone that just saves up money and travels and plays Frisbee tournaments. Many people before this person had done that. To me, a touring player has to be one of several things. Number one, somebody that goes out for at least a month and is making their income. In other words, they're feeding themselves competing or participating in disc golf tournaments. I don't think you have to win prize money to be on tour. You could be an amateur who wins prizes and sells those prizes and runs doubles events in between tournaments, but you're sustaining yourself from disc golf. Or if you aren't someone who's making any money, but I think if you've gone out for, let's say, 3 months, even if it's just saved up money, hit the road, okay, you're definitely on tour at this point. I mean, you're on the road for 3 months, you're paying your dues. The first player to do this was a player from Canada named Glen Whitlock. Now, Glen Whitlock managed to go out and tour, even though there wasn't really a tour yet, in the mid 80s. And the way he did this, Glen had a couple things about him that made this possible. The first was, Glen was a professional eater. He actually would enter eating competitions. It's a great way to win free meals. It's a great way to go to restaurants and get the 72-ounce steak for free if you can eat it in an hour, or the 2 large Fat Joe's pizzas or whatever promotions they have. Great way to get free food. There's eating contests. But Glen was serious about this. The biggest thing Glen did is that he only ate at all-you-can-eat restaurants that cost less than $1 per plate. Now, this is what this meant. If the restaurant had one thing, like say pizza or spaghetti, he would typically only be able to eat about 5 or 6 plates because it got monotonous and he just couldn't make himself eat more than 6 plates of one thing. So if it cost $8 for an all-you-can-eat spaghetti thing, it didn't make sense. He only got 5 plates for $8. However, if there was variety in the buffet, Glen could eat 8, 9, or 10 plates. And I'm talking massive heaping plates of food. 9, 10 plates of this. And if you think I'm just exaggerating for the video, Go find any disc golfer in your community with a PDGA number that's 3 digits and ask them. Everyone has seen Glen do this. Glen would eat for several hours. It was mind-boggling. But if he could do that for $8, 10 plates of food, less than $1 a plate, then you wouldn't have to eat for several days. Great way to sustain yourself on tour. The other thing Glen did was he didn't drive. So Glen would go to a tournament, and then he would find someone at that tournament that was having a tournament in the next week or two, which sometimes could be like 500 or 800 miles away. There weren't that many tournaments. And he would ride back with them to their town. He'd crash on somebody's floor because disc golfers would always put you up. And, you know, he might have won $90 at the tournament, but he could feed himself for 2 weeks off $90. And if he couldn't get a ride, he would just grab his backpack and his golf bag, stand by the side of the road, stick his thumb out, get to the next town. You know, next to the word legend in the disc golf dictionary should be a picture of Glen. I mean, legendary what this guy did. First one to actually tour back when tournaments would give $150 for first place sometimes and $10 for third. Glen lived off disc golf. But it wasn't a tour. The reason I say the Can-Am series was the first tour was because it was geared towards let's get people to hit the road and actually compete in tournaments. In other words, it wasn't just a point series. It was let's coordinate 10 tournaments. They were in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Canada. And let's put them on consecutive weekends geographically, even though they're in one region. Let's actually put them geographically so the players would have to drive as few miles as possible between. And let's encourage people to come out and actually tour. Like, this was unheard of at the time. And these tournament directors in up in that region of our country did this. Oh, not our country in Canada. And so they built that, and then not long after, Dwayne Utek came up, and then he actually put a bunch of money and a bunch of promotional efforts into it as well. And the Can-Am series, in my opinion, was the first tour. And when that happened, when that tour was going on, a player by the name of Dan Ginley out of Arizona played a tournament in New Mexico, which he won, and then heard about, remember, no internet, right? So then he heard about, hey, there's a tournament in Dallas the next weekend. So he drove to Dallas and won that. And then he got wind of, hey, there's 10 tournaments coming up in the Northeast called the Can-Am Series. This is 1991, I believe. And Dan said, well, I'd like to do that. Oh, no, I think 1990. He says, I'd like to do that. And he went up there and he played the Can-Am Series. So Dan was the first person to tour in his own vehicle from town to town on an actual organized tour. So the following year, his friend Steve Valencia out of Los Angeles said, well, that sounds like fun. I'd like to do that. And next thing you know, Steve Valencia is traveling with Dan Ginley. Steve's now the third player on tour when he did that. And then not long after, Jeff and Johnny Lissaman and Mike Williams out of California went and toured. They were players 4, 5, and 6. They had success on the Can-Am Series. So that was the tour, was the Can-Am Series. And then around that time, and I don't have the years right, but it was around that time, John Houck created the Circular Skies over Texas series down in Texas. And at that series, to the best of my knowledge, no one actually hit and traveled from event to event. I think John might be the first person to actually break even running a disc golf series. Dwayne Utek lost a ton of money, you know. Props to Dwayne. He took a lot of money out of his own pocket and gave it to our sport to try to help us grow. Oh, well, it did help us grow. So that's what, so John Houck actually sold this, and I think he might have kept his head afloat doing it, which is amazing. And then not long after that, Mike and Michelle. I know Mike Cousins, and I believe Michelle was a part of it. Sorry, Michelle. I think you were in a part of this at the time. But the Cousins came up with wait, what am I saying? You know, I'm not going to edit this video. Michelle was part of the picture at this time. I'm so sorry. She wasn't there when Mike started playing, but when the NorCal series, 10 events around Northern California were created, she was there. They created the NorCal series, and then they took off to run the world's first disc golf resort in Wisconsin, Sandy Point, a year later, still going strong. And then Leonard Muse took over the NorCal series. And then the NorCal series became the third series of its type in the sport. No one came out and just toured that series either. The reason I call those, there were many tours where the Circular Skies and NorCal were created with the idea of people touring. It just didn't happen. The sport was just too small at that point. Lots of players went to all 10 events, but then they went to their jobs Monday through Friday. So those were the first attempts at an actual tour. The reason why this is so important is that in the around that time, people sanctioned tournaments, and they asked for a date and they sanctioned them. There were conflicting dates, or there were big tournaments on opposite ends of the country on back-to-back weekends, and the coordination was done a lot of times internally. The idea of state coordinators was, I believe, was starting to come into existence then. But I mean, pre-internet especially, I mean, coordinating things was just a logistical nightmare, especially when we're talking about, remember, these are volunteers that are doing this, aside from the administrator. And then the PDGA ended up getting passed along as the administrator role. There were organizational issues, and it went to Becky Powell, basically saved the PDGA by reorganizing all the information. She spent a year of her life basically taking everything that was there and organizing it. It was an unorganized organization. No fault of the people running it. It's just, it was growing, and we were volunteers. I don't take credit. Anyways, and then Brian Honegger took over and took it another step further, and then Pat Govang stepped in as commissioner and took it another step further, and everybody kind of played a part in making this thing grow. As far as the touring lineage, I got to be number 7 on that list of players to go out and tour. Not long after Sam Ferens, John Brooks, and Nina DeVille toured. Nina DeVille, I believe, at least according to my definition, would be the first woman on tour. There were women that traveled and played disc golf, you know, for sure, in other disc sports, but she was making a living. She was winning the tournaments that she played and living off it. So I think she was the first a woman to tour. You know, not long after that came the Winnie crew with Avery Jenkins and Todd Branch and Dave Feldberg and Al Shack and Sue Stevens and Juliana Corver. I don't recall which of them was the second woman to tour, so forgive me, but they both were, they're like the middle-ish to the late 90s. They were out there touring. So that's how the tour basically formed. The people running the events were making up running events as they went along. The people creating series were making up creating series as they went along. Even the touring players, I like to say that, like, we all did something that was impossible, to go out and tour. And the reason why I define what we did as impossible, because clearly it wasn't impossible, but the reason I call it impossible is if you asked 1,000 people off the street or 100 disc golfers if it was possible to go out and make a living playing disc golf for a living, it would be a near 100% no. That's not possible. And so everybody was just kind of making this thing up as we went along. But that's the origin of the tour. It was the Wild West, and every year it was a little bit less wildy and a little bit less westy, and a little more organized. And you get people like Brian Henniger and Pat Govang, people like that stepping into the organization. Tournament directors started to become more experienced, and soon the PDGA was starting to coordinate these things. There were still series out there, but the PDGA was able to coordinate the tour and put it more and more together, and it's evolved into what we have today. But the people that did this, like, none of this happens today if it wasn't for, my God, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of tournament directors out there and clubs that put their time into this. And like, we're bearing the fruits of their labors, but I hope no one forgets that it's on the backs of giants, right? We are standing on the shoulders of giants in our sport right now. And the giants are the people from the 70s and 80s and the 90s that were making up this sport and the pro disc golf tour as they went along. So if this is interesting, I could easily take any one of these subtopics and do an entire video about that, or even put together something comprehensive for the whole history of the tour. I think it would be a lot of fun to do. But let me see what the interest level's like. So click like, click subscribe, comment, and I will just see what the feedback's like. Thanks, guys.